so great to be here and in the pouring rain, and it's really lovely to see people that I know here, and also to have met somebody who came from the Maldives, because I wanted to remind you all that in the last government, their parliament and their cabinet had a meeting underwater to just talk about the impact of climate change and really bring it home. And I'm going to talk tonight about taking up some of Brian's points about a process that we have used. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how climate change is seen by others who are probably secular, or even others who are religious, who call people like me involved in a pseudo-religion or a bogus religion or a substitute religion. I'm going to talk about the damage of that. But I wanted to start off by, Brian's already acknowledged the traditional owners, but I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that I've been doing, sort of blitzing in the last few weeks. We have a big team of scientists and social scientists working on a project at UQ and Griffith that deals with people's values, again, Brian's point, from the catchment to Moreton Bay and the islands. And so my job at the moment is to interview as many stakeholders as I can and ask them about how they value Moreton Bay. What do they do there? What are the effects? What are the motivations? What do they think about when they're there? And what's interesting when you ask about a range of values, and we have a typology of values like scientific ecologistic, like emotional humanistic, psychologistic, and spiritual. And I've been surprised at some people who completely can go diving and fishing in the bay and see it as utilitarian. And I ask about, what about the aesthetic values? Oh no, I'm out to catch a fish. What about being with the family? Oh yeah, that's good, but it's the fish that make the difference. And I've been really interested, though, to see the difference between user groups and people who use the bay and maybe don't have much knowledge of the marine park or bay ecology or climate change, and compare that to the stakeholders who do have knowledge, and even some of the leading industry marine people that I've spoken to in the last week, who have a deep, deep spiritual resonance for places on the bay and the marine park. And one person told me yesterday how he goes to the bay every morning. It's part of his day. And he does something he calls creating the day, where he meditates and he really watches what's happening. And he asks God or the universe for a sign after he's done this. I'm sure this is to run his business. And he explained how he was sitting on, I think it was Wellington Point or Victoria Point, sitting on a jetty, and he'd done his morning, please give me a sign, God. And up popped a dugong's head and sort of smiled at him, and he thought, now that's the sign. So that's the kind of thing, but that's rare. People are so reluctant to talk about their religious and spiritual connections. And when I've done other work where I'm talking to religious people or people who are environmental activists with a spiritual kind of affiliation to the earth and the planet, which was my PhD research, I've never been struck by people not willing to wax lyrical about their experiences in nature. And I've struck that today with a diver and a sports fisher, and I was really surprised. And so I wanted to tell you, in doing the work on values, what we're trying to do is to provide management with a broad, that the Department of Environment, or what used to be the DERM, Department of Environment and Resource Management, in the state government, it wants a monitoring and evaluation program of the Moreton Bay Marine Park. And that's what we're doing, driving it through qualitative research on people's values. It's really interesting. But today I wanted to talk to you about, go back to religion, but I thought if I just told you what I did and it relates to Brian's work, you'd see that the idea of values is very, very important in management, and I hope that it will be in resource management, because they're the things that you've said in relation to managing a fire or managing a drought. I think what's really important is to take a lesson from what Brian said, which is about reaching across sectors and involving and integrating religions and belief systems to bring a stronger understanding of climate change. But religious organisations are currently poised and are doing an unbelievable amount of environmental work. We just don't see it. For example, earlier this year, and I'm part of a group called the Queensland Churches Environment Network, our group linked with people in Toowoomba. And we had a meeting there that was run by the Catholics, the Anglican Church and the Uniting Church against coal seam gas. And we invited farmers, or they invited farmers to come along and talk about what had happened to them in the situation of coal seam gas. And then one of the members from Brisbane, a Uniting Church person, talked about the theology of fracking, or fracking theology. And so what was really interesting about that was that for a long time churches didn't engage out there in the public sphere. And suddenly we had the Catholic Bishop of the Toowoomba Diocese saying there's a whole lot of issues around now about duty of care towards people, especially towards young children who are perhaps the most vulnerable. And we want to protect children at all levels. And if the effects of health from coal seam gas are going to have long-term effects, then I think they need to be seriously looked at. But the Queensland Government report in March found that there was no link between coal seam gas activity and the health complaints, particularly amongst those who live in the Tara region, the poorer people, but recommended continuous monitoring of public health. So here's the social justice reason for churches speaking out against coal seam gas, the health of the community. And I'm starting with this example because the health of the community is compromised when the health of the planet is compromised. There's a direct link between the two. And this relationship between community, religion, and the effects of climate and environmental change are the focus of what I'm going to talk about a little bit. Whether it's the work the religions are doing on ecological matters, on climate change, or coal seam gas and social justice, or working on the front line to assist the communities after the natural disaster in 2011, and Erin Galoni and I have done research on this and spoken at the Multi-Faith Centre about our research. Erin's just wave, Erin. These issues are rarely reported in the media, but they're celebrated by the people who know what's happening. And I think as a former journalist and current affairs journalist, I'm really shocked that the media doesn't report this. And then I thought, why doesn't the media report this? Because I know people like Peter's Church have a media office. And as a producer of current affairs, like a Q&A show I used to do at ABC and a morning radio show like Steve Austin in Melbourne, if people didn't ring me and really talk to me passionately about why this issue was important, or I didn't know about it, a media release coming in just went in the pile. But if you spoke to me and rang me, this was what I thought was important. And I don't know how much religions do that because they're so overwhelmed with so much work and so much activity and not much funding that these things are hard to do. So we've got this kind of circular, it's not a conspiratorial issue that things aren't being reported, but I think it's a pragmatic one. But all religions are acting across many areas, and I quite like this, Peter. This is one of your confreres at the Gosford Anglican Church who constantly has these great signs at his church. Sacking the Climate Commission is crap, he says, or no fracking way was another one, or, and there's some quite good ones which I won't go into on same-sex marriage. But religious organisations all across Australia are working actively and engage in climate change and action in various ways. Most have environmental committees, develop policies, doing environmental audits. Some, like those involved in Angley Green, have developed a community garden in inner Brisbane, a sort of meditative garden. And other religions are particularly active, like the Al Ghazali Centre in Sydney that was on the ABC's gardening show a few weeks ago. And they've been working for a few years now with local councils along the Cooks River in Sydney to restore and replant the area. And you can see here what it used to look like and what it looks like now. And this project seems to epitomise the kinds of practices and principles put forward by Brian. Working across the community. Imagine working with local councils and really promoting that Muslims can do something to beautify the region, not be seen like the media tends to epitomise Islam and Muslims. Honouring God's creation along the river. In Queensland, churches like the church in Caloundra have gone solar, and the Catholic bishops in Queensland have joined together and are continually doing this kind of action work to protect the Great Barrier Reef. The bishop's pastoral letter in part stated, "Many of the environmental problems harming the reef are harming the planet generally. To redress this, we Catholics are called by Pope John Paul II to an ecological conversion, to authentically live up our ecological vocations so that we prepare for future generations an environment closer to the plan of the Creator." Closer to the plan, Brian, to fit your own plan. But despite these religions aiming to green, and if I could also say blue, the earth as well, those sceptical of climate change will often relegate groups involved in climate change action, including religious groups, to being involved in a substitute religion. This week, and I read this yesterday as reported in the British newspaper The Independent, our former Prime Minister John Howard referred to climate change believers as delivering alarmist conclusions on global warming. He termed the so-called belief in climate change a substitute religion, and added that he'd always been a bit of an agnostic himself about climate change, adding, "I don't completely dismiss the more dire warnings, but I instinctively feel that some of the claims are exaggerated." Think of the word instinctively feel. I haven't read the science, but I feel something's not quite right. So this message contrasts with the thousands of victims this week in the terrible storm in the Philippines, with the Filipino spokesperson at the climate change deliberations in Warsaw a couple of days ago, linking the superstorm and the devastating effects, especially of social vulnerability, with climate change. In John Howard's speech, which he called "One Religion is Enough," he congratulated the current Prime Minister for challenging what he sees as a political consensus on global warming. He described Tony Abbott's stance as courageous. So when I break these things down, the view that climate change is a religion, or is it just a belief system, and thus suspect, is not new. What's new is that for the people like the Prime Minister and the Queensland Premier, climate change is not just a substitute for religion, but by using the term in this way, both religion and climate change knowledge and participation are devalued and discounted or not taken seriously. Thus, in the minds of the skeptics, even those who have strong religious affiliation at other times, like the two Prime Ministers, the connection between religion and climate change in a broad sense can be discredited or overlooked in policy deliberations. We don't want you're religious. I think the idea of knowledge and power is very important. Who has the knowledge, who has the power, and who controls the debate? Again, these are issues that you raised in your talk. Those of us who are advocates for climate change action, according to this critique, should have no place in policy deliberations or national debates on serious issues affecting the Australian economy and Australia's future. I say this with Brian's important innovative deliberative peace-building practices in mind. What's also important about climate change, about claiming climate change is a new green religion, is that it shifts the emphasis on climate change science to the realm of something which is a questionable belief. It's not true, is it? I instinctively feel this. Climate change then is a matter of faith, not a matter of fact. Something for the realm of the supernatural, perhaps, and thus has no place in policy, politics, or business. Can you see the link there? So is this kind of discourse damaging to religion or damaging to climate change? And who does it help? Can deliberative community-based discussions then, along the lines that Brian's talked about, help people come together? Well, the risks, I've missed out a slide. The risks are not so great if it's not taken seriously, because we can make our stance, but the poor polar bears are looking for a way to be directed to the ark. They're teetering like the Gold Coast and some of the Gold Coast houses on the edge. And when you travel overseas, as I've done recently, and go to Scandinavia and go right to the top of Norway into the Arctic to the Lofoten Islands, people there are not sceptical about climate change. It's right on their doorstep. they're concerned about it, worried about it. If I go kayaking up near Alaska in the Pacific Ocean, the Inuit and the Haida and the other native Canadians that we talk to, they don't think climate change is a skeptical issue or a pseudo-religion. They're really worried about what's happening on their doorstep. So with this in mind, I wanted to talk a little bit about some research that we did in southeast Queensland last year, where we compared scenic rim in the catchment, Logan in the urban and peri-urban areas, and Redlands along the coast, about their perspectives on climate change, the values that they held. And we found, perhaps it's the proximity to Moreton Bay, that the people in Redlands, or perhaps it was the work the council had done, the people in Redlands were far more savvy about climate change effects than the people up in the catchment. And I think this is really important because our work tried to link upstream and downstream ideas and values, and still does now when we're looking at the waterways in general. And the general manager of NCARF, Dr. Dave Rizek, one of your pals at Griffith, spoke about the future impacts of climate change in southeast Queensland. And he reported that there'll be potential climate change outcomes for the area as an increased frequency and severity of heat waves, rising sea levels, more frequent and more prolonged droughts, more intense storms, and like today, more intense rainfall events. But I think that's the norm for this time of year. So how did communities prepare? And what can we followers of what's deemed the bogus religion do to bring about more awareness to the community without seeming like we're preaching the apocalypse or the end of days, which is another critique labelled at people who are climate change supporters. Most Australians, in a study done by CSIRO in 2011, 83% believe that climate change is a problem and that the climate is changing, but only half the population, and maybe it could be less now, believe it's anthropogenic. The views depended on where you stack up on your political preferences. Well, obviously we know more Labor and Green would be supporters and more Liberal National Party not so much. But green behaviour, they found, depends on the ethical and moral attitudes and values and understanding about climate change and whether it's personally meaningful for you to do anything. So if it is, you'll take action, and if not, you'll stay home and go to church on the Sunday rather than to the march in relation to climate change. So these are questions I think that we need to deal with, but what was really fascinating that came out of the research is that both climate change supporters and climate change deniers think that there's more people who are climate change deniers than climate change supporters. Both sides think that. Where does that come from? Why do we think that? How can we change that? So what we started to go and do, and this will be probably right, that I don't have a lot more time. Okay. So I wanted to just go through the process because Brian talked about a process and I'd like to discuss a little bit about that if I may. So last year I was part of this large research team that involved the DAF Department, Agriculture, Fisheries and Forests. It involved South East Queensland catchments, Healthy Waterways, Griffith Uni and people at UQ. And our task was to address the potential effects of climate change across the region, specifically to develop a location-based analysis of the region's understanding of and action towards mitigating and adapting to the risks and opportunities brought about through climate changes and extreme weather events. That's right, isn't it, for people who were there? Our research team is this multifunctional, multi-faith, as in science and climate change, group of people, including the traditional owners. We collaborated in designing and organising a series of climate roundtables across the region, in rural areas, peri-urban and urban, and along the coast and the islands offshore. We held 4 meetings, 3 separate, and one to try and make the connections across South East Queensland. Could people see upstream and downstream values? Could the people in the catchment area look at the mid-river and the Logan area? Could people in Logan look up and down? And we shared information. We started off with the traditional owner welcome, and here's Auntie Joan Hendricks, who also is the head of the Quandamooka Lands Council at Redlands. Participants shared their information about their memories of the climate and weather patterns they'd experienced over time. So we shifted the emphasis for something called climate change, and we called it climate variability. And we had people sitting around and discussing, I remember, in 100 years ago or 50 years ago, or Dad told me about, until Auntie Joan put up her hand and said, can you go back 40,000 years? It was a really poignant moment. So we did a very strong interactive and participative practice, identifying the risks and having a climate briefing that was scientific. Here are the people talking about, this is the sort of timeline, and here's Neil Cliff from DAF, about the kind of processes that we did. And this was the second kind of process that we did that was quite a deliberative process, where we got sticky shower curtains. Like we went to Spotlight, sprayed shower curtains with gunk, and we had these little cutouts of cardboard where people were asked to look at issues around storm or drought or flood or fire or sea level rise. And then within each area, different groups would try to look at the impacts of social and ecological effects about the storm, or social ecological effects about fire and so on. And if anybody would like a copy of our little booklet about that, I'm happy to email it to you if you email me at UQ. So the thing I wanted to talk about, because it was something that I learned about the process and religion and climate change, and this will be the last point I want to make. At our climate roundtable in Logan, and we did this kind of process, we were bowled over when one of the community representatives from the Pacific Islander culture and community stood up and said, the very first thing in our morning, asked, what will happen when the sea rises in the Pacific Islands and we're confronted with environmental refugees by the score? We were bowled over by the global importance of a comment like that. And I won't comment on when a Pacific Islander comes, do we put them back into the Pacific Islands on the boat? But the religious response was slightly different, and I think this is an important learning process for anybody setting up these deliberative democracy processes. Although religion wasn't our focus at all, there were some Buddhists, Muslims and Christians at all the round tables, but there was no outward discussion of religious issues. At one of the meetings, a Muslim representative stood up. He's a scientist, and he proceeded to talk about the science of climate change. And I thought, what would have happened, or what would have the response been, if he'd also mentioned that climate change action is important because it honours God's magnificent creation, or quoted the sacred Quran? Would we have listened? During our process, I learnt that setting up a community-based roundtable, based on many of the principles outlined by Brian earlier, the participants tend to support the structure and the themes that they come along to. They go along with the processes we established and engage with the dialogue, particularly the scientific dialogue, and so are unlikely to raise issues of faith and texts as rationales for taking action on climate change, which is what you said about your perspective on reason. Perhaps questions of social justice or climate justice might be one good way to bridge the gap. So, what's the discourse? Can religions use religious frameworks to express their faith, or do they have to use scientific or political discourse to discuss and engage in climate change and be seen to be rational, not people who practice a substitute religion? People at our meetings focused more on practical solutions. They talked about the need for greening local communities and economies, as well as protecting environments and wildlife, rather than discussing their personal outlooks that were more uncertain. They didn't have an instinctive feeling, for example, that something needed to be done. They acted on pragmatism. Although we did include local religious leaders in the roundtables, our focus, which became theirs too, was on the pragmatic, and thus did not sufficiently address the personal, psychological, or spiritual implications of climate change. I'd like you to contemplate that as I'll hand over to Peter, because that, I think, is a really important question. Thank you very much.